G'day and welcome back to Critical AFL on YouTube for another late night caffeine-free tea edition of WAFL-Watch for our hit out between Claremont and the WAFL Eagles today. Fun fact from today's Anzac Day clash, the 1:40 time slot was actually over an hour before final selection was announced for our AFL squad, just because we're playing on Sunday. So I'm not sure if this has happened before or if the VFL sides have had that combination of times at all, just with the time difference. And also not sure if the lower end of our 23 is likely to influence selection decisions at Hawthorn. But it was interesting to know that if you wanted to, you could have figured out our final side before that announcement deadline and significantly beforehand. But anyways, it's just a unique observation that I don't think is likely to happen too often. And this wasn't exactly a week where key personnel were up against that deadline. So we'll get into the format for this week's episode of WAFL-Watch. Firstly, we'll be covering the best performance in the side, what I thought was impressive, and if the efforts were AFL worthy or just promising. Then I'll be sharing my key takeaways from the match before the final and possibly the segment that most West Coast fans are interested in, who I think is pushing for a spot in the AFL side next week. Although that said, I'd love to hear from anyone following these WAFL reviews, what your main interest is when you tune in to listen. Is it just to get a feel for who could come into the AFL side? Or is it a broader interest in all the West Coast squads? Or is it just a time filler for exercise and chores around the house? You're not too fussed about either way. But let me know if you are fixated on any little details, because it might help me fine tune the focus for these little niche within a niche videos, being a West Coast only channel and then West Coast WAFL Eagles within that. But anyway, before we get stuck into the program for today, I'd like to make my humble request, as always, to anybody watching that isn't a subscriber to please consider subscribing to the channel and making sure you never miss one of these or my AFL review videos again. As I say every week, I'm currently aspiring to reach 1,000 subscribers so that the channel will allow my future videos to become monetized. And as I also say every week, until we get there, that commitment to produce these videos and put them out in a timely fashion is just a very time-intensive passion of mine. So please, if you're enjoying the content, every new subscriber and every existing subscriber for that matter is a massive help. But let's get down to the review now. In the bests, at the very top of my best players today was Clay Hall. He looked an absolute class above the WAFL opposition from Claremont, which I might add had 3 Sandover medalists amongst them. That's just a little fun fact, courtesy of Sean, who I was chatting to through the game. But Hall was dominant across the entire 4 quarters, and in the first quarter in particular, he was 50% of a 2-man army alongside Tom Gross that blew Claremont away in the midfield battle at the start of the contest. Unfortunately, because there is something structurally wrong with our backline of the WAFL side, a dominant midfield didn't translate into a dominant scoreboard. So by the time Claremont patched up the midfield, they didn't really have any significant deficit to chase down. But Hall's ability to break into space with almost every possession he had was unreal. And for me personally, after a performance last week that I thought demanded a spot in the AFL side for this weekend, I thought he looked out of place at the centre of WAFL stoppages that couldn't hold him in. So that's probably a little bit of a spoiler for the end of this video. I really think that he is almost undeniable for an AFL spot again next week. The next one's Tom Gross. So Gross started the game the best player on the field by a fair bit by the end of the first quarter. He led that early charge I was just talking about that put us ahead of Claremont at the first break, probably by a lot less than we deserved. I think we had like 7 behinds that were all potential goals. Unfortunately, you could see the Claremont Tigers, put a fair bit of time into him after the first quarter. And that did manage to curb that, win the game off your own boot form that he was in. But he still remained impactful the whole way through and was still among our best players by the end of the day. But the impact per possession did come down when they started really putting time into him. Also, an exciting thought that's probably worth noting, when I talk about guys like Hall and Gross dominating in the WAFL against, like I said, Sandover medalists, I'm talking about 2 players who are 19 and 18 years old, respectively, Hall and Gross. So putting today's result aside, you're looking at a couple of teenagers who went toe-to-toe with 3 senior stars of the WAFL from start to finish today. And I think that right there is enough evidence to say that these aren't guys that we need to wonder about making it at AFL level, which is a big relief after how little we've seen in the way of midfielders from the draft for years now at West Coast. But then back to the best players, rounding out the top three of the match is Jobe Shanahan. For an 18-year-old again, he looks like a Rolls Royce of a forward who will, without a doubt, be a star of the AFL one day also. I know there was talk of him being versatile as a key defender as well as a forward over summer, but I'm really glad that West Coast haven't pushed him back just because of our key back situation. He kicked 2 goals today and he delivered an inside 50 pass from the boundary that was so clean that you can see already that he has the composure and class at a level that you can't really teach, along with that vision and skill to execute decisions at that elite level. So when we were on top early, he was really the guy capping off that trio of young draftees for West Coast that took control of the game against Claremont. Unfortunately, the availability for spots for key forwards, like I think I've said a few weeks in a row now, is ridiculous at West Coast. And it would require us to drop guys who I just don't think any fan would be okay with dropping. What I'm talking about is the fact we've probably got 4 talls in the AFL side when you probably should be looking at 3 as it is. But watch that space because Jobe Shanahan's in his first year and he has all the time in the world. Other than the best players I mentioned, I thought there were other noteworthy efforts from Harvey Johnston, Bailey Williams, Rhett Bazzo, Malachi Champion, and Sandy Brock. And I don't want this to come off too harshly because a big undertone of these videos is really about who's preparing to step into the AFL side. So I do feel I'm kind of obliged to be clear that when I mentioned guys like Harvey Johnston and Bailey Williams playing in our best, it was one of the better contributions to the WAFL side, but not really in a way that I think at the moment is pressing their case at AFL level, unfortunately. And on the flip side, at the same time, when I'm talking about guys like Rhett Bazzo, Malachi Champion, and Sandy Brock, they might not be dominating the WAFL games just yet, but they're guys who I think are starting to really show AFL attributes and probably just need to start putting together full 4-quarter performances week in, week out, and generally just getting more senior game experience into them. As I mentioned before, Malachi Champion's got a really incredibly high game IQ. It's a bit like Noah Long, what he showed immediately as he came to West Coast in his first year. And then he's got the playing style. This is Champion, by the way, of Willie Rioli. So I do think we found another really brilliant long-term prospect with him. Bazzo, I think, is going to end up being a guy who can cement his place in our backline if he can put his injuries behind him and just start training and playing every week without interruption. The next key back as well, Sandy Brock, I just think was a steal. He's 198 centimetres, athletic, and reads the game really well down back. So I'm not sure why Gold Coast didn't feel they needed him, but he could very easily be a very good key defender too for us. And then I suppose while I'm on the key defender notes, it's probably also worth mentioning that Callum Jamieson looks surprisingly adequate. And don't take that the wrong way for a guy who hasn't played a game of footy in over 12 months. So that was his first game back today. And I say adequate because I actually think that with all the trouble we're having to find a permanent key tall to go in alongside Gov at the AFL level, he could quite possibly be a good candidate to push himself right to the front of that pack by the end of this year once he builds himself up with his game fitness. So that's probably a more in-depth look at all the individual performances in the WAFL side this week than normal. And I hope that that's a really promising and upbeat review to listen to, because that does take me to my key takeaways from today's match, which are a little bit more negative this week than usual. And just on that note, when I come up with these key takeaways, I don't actually try to create a narrative or manipulate the tone of what I've watched. I usually just find that towards the end of the game, there are a couple of things that stand out to me that are worth talking about. And unfortunately, the first key takeaway was an observation. It is purely limited to the WAFL side, but it's probably not the best. And I have already heard a lot of people describe our side in the WAFL as a failed experiment. But to be perfectly honest, today's probably the first time that I've watched and thought there is something wrong with the format of us having a reserve side in the WA State League. So to give that some context, up until now, we've had a devastating injury list for years that I've always thought makes it too hard to judge the WAFL performance by. On top of that, I think the overall quality of our list has been really poor, the larger list, not just the 23 that plays every week. So after a really big cull of that list last year, 2025 has always looked, in the lead up to this season, has looked like the first chance we'd have to see our WAFL team succeed. That said, today we played 16 AFL listed players, and all the non-AFL names were WAFL quality names like Yo, that's Elliot's cousin, Lucassen, Mercer. The quality ran all the way down to that 22nd member of the WAFL squad. But watching the second half, the continuity that a WAFL league side gets from playing week in, week out with each other, I'm talking about Claremont, Subiaco, East Fremantle, is a stronger hand than the talent that we're able to bring just because we've got guys that are AFL potential. So the only thing I'll say in counter to that is I could be wrong, and the talent in our twos is still predominantly first and second year players. And it's also possible that a little bit further into this season, they'll be a more well-oiled machine that are familiar with each other. But I just felt like for the first time watching today's game, I did have concerns for whether our WAFL side is capable of competing with, the WAFL level that is really more experienced than them. But anyway, the other key takeaway, and it's again probably not too relevant to the AFL side, but I've been watching for a while now, and I can honestly say that with my hand to heart, that umpiring in the WAFL is so much better than the AFL. And I'm certain that they're all working to the same rule book, but somehow the WAFL umpires manage to do their job week in, week out with hardly any contentious howlers. Don't ask me why. Our team of researchers at Critical AFL are looking into it, but my best theory is that there seems to be a little bit less pressure, and perhaps they just let a little bit more go on the WAFL, which makes the game flow better and look less contentious. But that's pretty much the two major key takeaways that I've got from today's video. And like I said, they are very WAFL specific, so there's nothing too profound reflecting on the AFL side. But all that said, that brings me to the predictions for team selection next week, so after the Hawthorn match for the AFL side. First up, I know I thought he deserved the call up this week against Hawthorn, but after today's performance, like I said earlier, I'm almost certain that Clay Hall's performance should be undeniable to deny a spot in the AFL side next week. The other one would be Tom Gross should also be in the consideration. He's probably just as far above the WAFL standard as Hall and put in a top-level performance despite the heavy attention he was getting, so I think he's also banging on the door. But then outside of those two guys, I don't think there's any really heavy pressure on the AFL side unless there's an injury or issues with form against the Hawthorn game a little bit later in the weekend, possibly. So that's it for this week's WAFL Eagles review. In summary, I do have concerns with the WAFL side as a team, but I'm also really excited with so many players in the list that are building form in the twos. So take from that what you will. It'll be an interesting wait for next week with the AFL team right at the end of the weekend, but a couple of guys, like I mentioned, absolutely banging on the door to the AFL side even before they play. So hopefully I get my way with the Clay Hall prediction at the very least at the next AFL team selection. But we'll have to wait until next week to see. And in the meantime, I'll hopefully see you all again for the AFL review against Hawthorn. And until then,